Hi, everybody. My name is Paige, and we are going to just wait a couple of minutes to let everybody sort of trickle in. So just sit tight and we'll start shortly. Hi, everybody. So we are just going to get started with our pollinator webinar series. This is Wetlands for Pollinators, and my name is Paige, and I'm from Habitat Acquisition Trust, and I am here with Laura Morandin, Amy Pelletier, and Kristen Miskelly as our partners for this amazing webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. So if you've done this before, you know the drill. There will be a short introduction and then we will jump into the content. So if you've heard the intro before, go grab a cup of coffee and come back and we will get started. So you may know the webinar is created by Pollinator Partnership Canada with us with Saanich Native Plants and Parks Canada. My name is Paige, as I said, I'm the stewardship coordinator. And I'm here with our partners, and I'm going to pass it off to them to just quickly introduce themselves. Laura, do you want to start?
Hi, thanks, Paige. I'm Laura Morandin, the Acting Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and the Acting Research Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and Pollinator Partnership in the US, our parent organization. And our mission is to conserve and protect pollinators and their habitat. And we do this through research, outreach and education, habitat creation, and policy advising. Thank you.
Great. And Amy?
Yes, hello. I am a Species at Risk Engagement Officer with Parks Canada. Here locally, I work at Fort Red Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Sites of Canada, and also at Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. Also here on the island, we have Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. So yeah, I have been involved in Garry Oak ecosystem restoration and coastal sand ecosystem restoration for the past decade or so. And as part of that, doing a lot of work propagating native plants and restoring habitat, including restoring habitat for pollinators. So thanks for having me.
Great, and Kristen?
Hi everybody, I'm Kristen Miskelly from Saanich Native Plants, and I'm a biologist and co-founder with the nursery, and we do native plants, native seeds, and also restoration consultation, and happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. So just to get us settled in a good way, we want to, we want to make sure folks know that this is the Pollinator webinar series on wetlands, and we're talking about the relationship between wetlands and pollinators, of course. And these are intricate and ancient relationships, and protecting them is essential. It's important at all times to be aware that these creatures, pollinators, and the landscapes of wetlands are a part of stewarded First Nations territories and are considered relatives to Coast Salish people in our area, in this area. So nations in this Greater Victoria area include the Esquimalt Nation, the Songhees First Nation, though they are both Lekwungen speaking nations, Lekwungen speaking peoples. There's also the Chiana Nation and the Sauk First Nation. And we also are in the territories of the Saanich people, and there are 5 nations included there: the Pakwachin, the Sayout, the Tsartlip, the Sekam, and the Malahat First Nations. And many of those are Sanchothan speaking people. And I just have on the bottom, if you're interested in learning a bit of Sanchothan, there's a lot of language resources, and I encourage you to take a look online. And they do tell you how to say words like Saanich, which is the Sanchothan pronunciation of Saanich. So opportunities for education about plants and animals is a real honor for all of us here today, and we hope there is an appreciation and stewardship garnered from nature through raising awareness. Okay, so we want to quickly thank our funders. This is made possible by all of these amazing folks, including our partners, as well as Van City Whole Foods and the Growing Together initiative. So we've got, 10 webinars in this series, and they're found on the Island Pollinator Initiative website. So go take a look. We've got 3 more open or about to be open. One of them is available for registration now, and that'll be on September 17th, identifying and monitoring pollinators, and then 2 more into the fall. So check it out on the website. All of the recordings will be available on the IPI website after each one is completed, including this one. Also take a look on the website about becoming a certified pollinator steward. It's a great program with Pollinator Partnership Canada. So today's talk is about an hour. We'll probably go a little over, but we'll do our best to get as much information as we can. But just remember, it is recorded. So even if we go kind of quickly, you can always go back, watch the recording, pause, replay sections. So you're welcome to definitely type your questions in the Q&A section. which you can find in the sort of the bar, probably at the bottom. And if you have questions for the moderators or the hosts, that's where you use the chat if you're dealing with technical issues. But questions about content for the speakers go in the Q&A. And we will have about 20 minutes at the end for questions, and we'll have 2 prizes at the end as well. So the first prize is going to be a hard copy of the Wetlands of BC Guide to Classification book. And Amy Pelletier from Parks Canada is our moderator, and I think Laura might be helping out too, but they will decide maybe a favorite question of theirs, and you'll get to pick up a copy of this at the hat office. So if your name gets called, if you could email me, and my email will be at the end of the webinar, to get your copy of the Wetlands Guide. A speaker's gift is a hat and a couple of seed packs, and they're all native seeds to Southern Vancouver Island. So that's just for local folks who are doing something around Southern Vancouver Island. So just to briefly brush up on our speakers, I introduced myself, but I work at Habitat Acquisition Trust, and I do a little bit of volunteering at Halliburton Farm in their wetland restoration site, as well as nerding about learning plants at the Native Plant Study Group. And Kristen is the co-owner and a biologist. Botany is her specialty, but definitely has passion for all things ecosystem restoration, native plants, and propagation. And we are excited to have her on board for this presentation on wetlands for pollinators. So I'm going to get started, and then Kristen's going to jump in and talk about restoration, and then I'll wrap up with resources to move on. So HAT is a local land trust, and we are keen to help people understand and care for nature, including wetlands. And we were able to put together this webinar for you thanks to our program funders for the Good Neighbors program, which are below there. And if you have any questions about HAT, go check out our website or ask me after this. So to get started, we wanted to chat a little bit about wetlands. And what are wetlands anyways? Well, generally they're, a body of water in some way, shape, or form, but how does that differentiate? Well, when wetlands are defined by the water, the soil, and the plants. We'll get into each of those. Generally, you can see this turtle in what looks like some sort of wetland. Looks beautiful on the surface, but if you look closer, it's a non-native red-eared slider turtle in invasive parrot's feather, and that's at Stone Ridge Wetland in View Royal. So not all wetlands are what they seem on the surface. So, as I mentioned, wetlands are defined by water. So that means generally wetlands occur where the water table is fairly high or near the surface, potentially above the surface. And the wetlands hydrology, or how the water flows in and out, how deep it is, the amount of flooding, affects the wetlands soil and plants. So the seasonal variations in a wetland's water level is called its hydroperiod. And together, the hydroperiod and the type of soil and plants it contains are used to define a wetland. So here's an example of a pond in Machosen. It was actually dug out of a swamp type wetland, and then the landowner also constructed a floating island out of pop bottles and burlap sacks. And there you go. Now that's kind of interesting. We'll get into identifying those swamp wetlands in a minute. So another feature, as I mentioned, wetlands are defined by soil. And in wetlands, soils are typically anaerobic or very low in oxygen, and that's because of the water presence there. So two groups of wetlands are, generally speaking, mineral and organic soil wetlands. If you've got an organic wetland, that means you've got a lot of accumulation of plant matter and other types of material on the surface. And so when those plants accumulate faster than they can decompose, it starts to form this peat material, this organic material. So you might be familiar with the word peat, and we'll talk about that as well. The other type of wetland soil is called mineral. Usually there's a bit of both organic and mineral, but if there's a lot of mineral, it's usually made up of sand, silt, and clay. And you can tell there have been effects of water on that mineral soil by looking at the color and the pattern. So this photo in the top there shows what's called glade soils, which means it's all gray. And that typically means it's permanently saturated. So if this soil just had gray, that would indicate that it was always saturated, whereas the mottling, or sort of those ribbons of red, is actually iron, and that means it gets seasonally saturated. So you can get deep into soil chemistry and soil science. There's actually a free soil course online. You can get the material if you Google Basic Soils Course Coast Forest Region. Check it out if you want to nerd out on soils. And the third defining factor of wetlands are the plants. And that's my favorite part. So only plants that can tolerate water will grow in wetlands. And so there is a fairly small, in terms of all the plants in the world, small and specialized group called hydrophytes. They live either in water or in moist soils, and they have special traits that let them capture and deliver oxygen to their roots, like special openings on the surface of the leaves, little air pockets to help them float, or sometimes no roots at all. One hydrophyte example locally is water smartweed, and this is a picture of that plant at Halliburton Wetland in Saanich. So to sum up, we now know the three primary traits of wetlands: water, soil, and plants. So it's water is close to the surface, has a hydro period. The soils are generally water saturated at some point, and soils have surface peat, or they've got that glaying mottling effect. And the plants that are present are typically water tolerant. So that means that they grow in soils that are fairly saturated for a good portion of their growing season. So now that you all know how to define wetlands, there are a few different types. So we're going to try and solve those different types. So I'm going to go through each one of these: swamp, marsh, bog, fen, and shallow open water. And I'll get back to this in a minute. So swamps are generally nutrient rich, and they support woody plants like trees and shrubs. This is an example of a cedar swamp with the beautiful swamp lantern, or some people call it skunk cabbage. You've got the cedar, you've got ferns, very beautiful, and you've got the swamp with the W in it, and that's your cue for woody. Swamp woody, get it? Okay. Marsh. Marshes are usually also nutrient rich, lots of nutrients in there, but mostly they have non-woody plants, things like cattails, reeds, rushes, sedges, and typically some open water. And an example of a marsh might be Somenos Marsh in Cowichan. I think that's a pretty beautiful marsh. You should definitely check it out if you've got that option. And I put bog and fen in the same slide because they're not as common. We're not going to go into detail about those ones, but generally they're very old wetlands, typically nutrient poor and very acidic. They have that peat we talked about, that very slowly decayed organic matter. Usually their water source is just precipitation, and the other one that's somewhat similar is the fen. So fens are similar to bogs, but they're a bit less acidic, a bit more nutrient rich. They do contain peat, but the difference is that the water source is more than just precipitation. They might get some water from a groundwater source or river. An example of a bog locally is Rithets Bog. So Rithets Bog used to be a cranberry bog before it was drained and farmed by good old colonist Robert Patterson Rithett. There's his weird little face there. It's a beautiful spot as well, so definitely worth checking it out. And lastly, we've got shallow open water wetlands. So generally those are smaller bodies of standing water, you might call them ponds, and less than 2 meters deep. More than 10% cover of rooted aquatic plants, but that doesn't necessarily include those fully aquatic ecosystems like lakes, rivers, and oceans. If you want to get into the, keying it out, there's a nice key for that. But if you just want to look locally at one, Beaver Ponds is a fairly good example of several shallow open water wetlands there. So as we said, the 5 official types of wetlands, but usually when you look at a wetland, you're looking at a wetland complex, which means there's a combination of 2 or more types of those 5 wetlands. And within those 5, there have been over 100 different wetland associated ecosystems defined. So the wetland biologists have really gone into detail with that, and I think Kristen might touch on that as well. But you might be wondering, what about seasonal wetlands? Because I know that's what I was wondering when I looked at this definitions list. And this is a fancy scientific chart to figure out which wetland you might be in based off of the soil characteristics. So you're looking at soil moisture, soil nutrients, pH, flood frequency, and something called the hydrodynamic index, which is really just the degree and influence of water on the site. So we are interested in other seasonal wetlands, and they've plopped them on top of this chart here, which is showing the wet meadows and flooding ecosystems are kind of on the top there. And that is to indicate they have a less frequent flooding and or duration. And it gives you a sense, a little bit more about that. But there are some pretty amazing seasonal wetlands, and Kristen's going to talk about those as well. Some of them are vernal pools, wet meadows, and like I said, seasonally flooded areas. And all those are very important habitat for pollinators. So just to back up a little bit, wetlands have had a bit of a up and down relationship with humans in history. We're going to pull up a poll, and I think Laura might be able to do that for us. And it's going to be about wetlands in Canada. So what percent of wetlands, oh, sorry, my computer's doing some funky things here. Canada is home to what percent of the world's wetlands? So you're all going to vote. Do you think it's 5%, 11%, 19%, or 25%? Sorry, that's probably annoying. Laura, do you have?
Yeah, we have 80% voted now, so I will just give it a couple more seconds here. It's still going up. If you want to vote, get your vote in, and I'll end it now.
Okay, So it looks like about 15% of you guessed 5%. 11% of you guessed 11%. That's a coincidence. The majority of you, about 50% of you, voted for 19%, and 6 of you voted for 25%. The correct answer is 25%. So Canada is home to about a quarter of the world's wetlands, which is pretty amazing. And wetlands occupy 1.2 million kilometers squared of Canada's total landmass, which works out to be about 14% of Canada's total landmass are wetlands. And that's primarily in sort of the prairies in Ontario, back east, but there are lots in northern BC as well. They're a really important part for all kinds of reasons. Wetlands have been part of Indigenous communities since time immemorial, and they're a major importance and source of a lot of different things, including food and fiber, medicine, cultural and spiritual significance, and of course transportation. Wetlands can be used, you know, traveling by canoe, by boat, other things. They're really important parts of that. And for colonial history, as settlers arrived, wetlands were often perceived as wastelands and considered just available for conversion, typically to agriculture or other development. So many of the seasonal wetlands were drained for farming. And also a lot of those bogs and fens were valued for the peat that they contained. So peat was actually sort of, it used to be a source of energy, a fuel, and often an alternative for firewood, for cooking and heating. And now it's still used, still mined from bogs and sold as a growing medium in the horticulture industry and as a common ingredient in potting soils. So this bottom photo here is, I'll explain a little more about that one on the next slide. And the top one is the Saltwater Peoples Atlas by Dave Elliott Sr. And he compiled a lot of information, including those about wetlands and wet habitats, about the Saanich people. And so that would definitely be a great resource, and it's free online to learn more. So I had that example of ditching. So this was from 1926 in New Zealand, and Maori laborers were digging a drainage ditch in a mandatory government-funded program in New Zealand. And despite many Maori opposing those draining of wetlands, they participated as sort of labor because of the few wage jobs that were there. And just an example of what has happened. And even locally, we know of lots of different sites where historically there were many drainage tiles laid in wetlands. So this is an example of a clay drain tile. And in Illinois, you can see these settlers just digging up the wetland and putting in all these tiles. I thought that they were more like bathroom tiles when I heard the word first, but they're actually pipes, underground pipes, and they quickly and efficiently move the water off the land and into the local streams and rivers. So lots of water flowing off the land very quickly. And this is just an overhead example of how much drainage tile was laid in this one wetland that was being restored. And I think they said something like 43 miles of drainage pipe was put in there. You can see all the yellow lines are pipes that were put in. And if you're wondering where Putnam County, Illinois was, I had to look it up as well, and it's right there, southwest of Chicago. Lots of interesting wetland restoration happening out there. So back to our current space, threats to wetlands in BC. You know, we're going to have two polls come up just to get a sense of what kind of knowledge or ideas you folks have on threats to wetlands. And I think Laura is going to pull up the first poll, or the second poll here, and we will see. So in colonially settled areas of Canada, as we saw lots of examples of, what % of our wetlands do you think have already been lost? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that and see if we can figure out what it is.
Okay, we have about 70% that have voted now. So again, I'll give it another 5 seconds if you'd like to get your vote in.
All right, so the majority of you guessed the top amount, which was 99%. I think you were trying to outsmart the system there, because that's what I did last time. No one picked 20%. About 15% picked 40% of wetlands have been lost. A quarter of you picked 60%, and 30% of you picked 70%. And that 30% was correct. So we've lost about 70% of our wetlands in settled areas of Canada, which is pretty huge. And the other poll that we'll also pull up is about what sources of wetland loss might be the primary land conversion. So wetlands have been drained or lost primarily due to what type of land conversion in Canada? And I just put a small selection here. So if you want to guess, it's housing development, water management projects like hydro dams, agriculture, forestry, or mining. Which one do you think is the primary culprit of wetland loss? These are kind of dark questions. Sorry, everyone. But we'll learn about positives too. All right. Yay! So about a quarter of you guessed housing development. 2 people guessed water management projects, and the vast majority of you, about 70%, picked agriculture. And that is the correct answer. Yes. So agriculture has been the primary source of wetland drainage in North America. And that is so that the water is pulled off the land and we can then grow crops, put cattle, that kind of thing. So a lot of channelizing wetlands into ditches. But as I mentioned, it's not the only threat currently facing wetlands in BC. We've also got hydroelectric development that changes the water flows, urban housing developments, forestry, ranching, transportation, mining, oil and gas. Outdoor recreation can have an impact on wetlands, especially the smaller seasonal ones. And of course, climate change and invasive species. And this photo is taken at near the Lee Road intersection in Langford. And that was a formerly supposed red-legged frog habitat. So that's where that went. We all are familiar with that part. Okay, so why should we care about wetlands? Well, this is a diagram of what ecosystem services are, if you're not familiar, but generally it's human beings benefiting from the ecosystem in some way. So how do we as a species benefit? Here are a bunch of examples. So I'll just quickly run through a few of these. If you're interested in learning them more in depth, you can check out wetlands-initiative.org. And there's lots of great resources on that. But generally, you know, they're an amazing service that provides. So people call them nature's kidneys. They filter tons of sediment and pollutants as the water slowly moves through wetlands. A lot of that sediment and pollutants can drop and they're broken down by microbes. You know, folks have said that cattails and bulrushes can absorb heavy metals and fertilizers, but always wetlands have their limits. So we want to be able to support high diversity in these amazing habitats. So, you know, if we have higher biodiversity, we're going to see more resilience to climate change and the more support of all kinds of animal species. So they're also great for mitigating against climate change by storing carbon, protecting against floods, providing those services so that we don't have to create artificial versions, which saves us money. If you're interested in economic benefits, you can look up ecosystem service markets. But we're focusing on one of the ecosystem services, which is pollination. And wetlands really provide critical habitat for many pollinating species of insects. So we've got bats, but they don't pollinate here. They do help control insects. But our pollinators are interdependent with our wetlands. So wetlands provide clean surface water, mud, and moist soil, which pollinators depend on for reproduction, early survival of many invertebrate species need that. And then when they get older and become adults, they are pollinating for us. So wetlands actually have a really long window of flowering plants, especially in the late summer. That's kind of their time to shine. So early spring flowering plants like willows, and then the late summer blooms like goldenrod are really important. They also, as I mentioned, wetlands provide a diversity of nesting sites: rock, bare soil, mud, decomposing logs, rodent holes, and grass sort of clumps, grass tussocks. All of those are great nesting habitat. And then specific species of bees will depend on particular wetland types. And I had just heard of the example of this solitary bee, an adrena bee, that will visit this particular flower, Blenosperma nanum, and the photo is there. And the life cycle of this bee and this flower are really interconnected. And it will visit this flower and will emerge when this flower blooms. And they're specifically tied to vernal pools. And vernal pools are, as I mentioned, one of those important seasonal wetlands. So we're going to learn a little bit more about wet meadows and other seasonal wetlands from Kristen. But if you want to know more about vernal pools, you can go to vernalpools.org. So wetlands and pollinators are greatly connected. And if we can provide more diversity of habitats, wetlands included, we'll get more diversity of plants that support a greater diversity of pollinators. So now I'm going to pass it off to Kristen to talk about how do we know which wetland we're in based off of the plants we might see, and how can we create them for pollinators?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Paige. That was a great introduction. I'm going to start with some of the restoration techniques that are commonly applied to wetlands in our area. I'm going to highlight a few key areas where these applications are being made and local stewards of local wetlands. And time permitting, I'm going to spend as much time as I can looking at plant examples across the variety of wetlands that Paige has described. So that's wet meadow, marsh, swamp, open water, and some wetland shrub examples. And this picture, I was trying to find a picture that really spoke to wetlands. And part of it is the resiliency of wetlands and how wetlands can make meaningful recovery even with just invasive species removal, as long as they're not so severely degraded that they're non-existing, of course. But what you'll find is with some of the most like the worst invasive species of our area, if you remove them, you'll find colonization of wetland plants to some extent that's brought in through the air, by ducks, and just other vectors. And it really is incredible given the chance what wetlands can do. And this is in contrast to terrestrial systems, which often require even more inputs. And it's not to say wetlands don't need help or inputs after invasive species removal, but the wildlife response and so on is really remarkable. And it really gives me hope for how we can restore wetlands locally, what work's already been done, but even creating wetland spaces on your own properties or containers that just don't drain, and having wetland species in those and all those sorts of things. There's just so much potential there for all of us. So what I'd like to start with is a species called parrot's feather that Paige touched on. And this is the photo credit here is to the Invasive Species Council of BC. But there are local projects, some of the groups that are working, like Saanich Marsh and Stone Ridge Wetland, are working on this really quite persistent invasive species that occupies the surface water, closing open water spaces. And it really interferes with water flow, causing stagnant water. And then subsequently, you're not getting light through the water column, which you can imagine all the effects on other wildlife and also native vegetation within those water systems. And so there are some restoration techniques being applied there. At Saanich, they've tried a dredging technique called suction dredging, and also through shading out the Myriophyllum or parrot's feather. So how Saanich has been working on that is planting riparian vegetation like tall shrubs and trees on the riparian fringes. And as they overhang the water, they're shading out the parrot's feather, where it is a light dependent species. And that doesn't work just as a technique on its own, but that's done in combination with the actual mechanical removal of parrot's feather. And then Stone Ridge Wetland is doing fantastic work. They're actually working on some removal of parrot's feather now, followed by a planting event that Paige is going to touch on. So their planting event is in just a couple weeks, and we'll provide the details there. And in combination, or sorry, not in combination, but at Stone Ridge Wetland, they're working on smothering techniques for this invasive species. So with smothering, you can see in that picture where a piece of pond liner is being used to smother out a patch of parrot's feather. And this technique I'm going to go into detail further, because it's actually the restoration technique focus that I have for this presentation, where the pond liner or a similar material is non-porous, it doesn't let the light through, and it's a true barrier. And what you do is you put it down over vegetation, and ultimately it can kill it. And so we've used it, and other groups have been using it to kill invasive species. And so here you're seeing an application on parrot's feather, and I'll also show you some applications with reed canary grass. So here is a picture of reed canary grass, so Phalaris arundinacea. And I've been working on removing reed canary grass for about 12 years, and I couldn't help but chuckle today when I was going through tons and tons of photos, trying to find a picture of reed canary grass and couldn't find one. And I thought that's really testament to how much I really dislike this species, because I have photos of pretty much every plant except for this thing, and it's one I've worked on a lot. And this picture really shows you what reed canary grass can do. So in this wetland area, you can imagine without this super dominant rhizomatous perennial non-native grass, that what you would instead see was a diversity of wetland vegetation, including some open water sites. And it really outcompetes vegetation, changes the hydrological characteristics of a site, and ultimately you end up with a monoculture of this grass that is tremendously difficult to get rid of. We've been working on at Halliburton Farm and some other sites ways to get rid of reed canary grass. And so the pictures you're seeing here are areas that looked like this and are now a diversity of native vegetation that is very pollinator friendly. And as Paige mentioned, in wetland habitats, if you imagine this is all flooded with water through the winter, and as that water draws down, you get a succession of flowering that occurs later in the year than drier sites. So in sort of the dry end of Garry Oak ecosystems, as an example, where those would provide spring forage and blooms and resources for pollinators, this wetland habitat is providing the summer and early fall forage. So other photos of what was reed canary grass. So in this situation, these are depressions that were dug. So the reed canary grass was actually dug out of these holes, essentially making holes, which then fill with water. And so to some extent, you can also work on reed canary grass through deep flooding. So these are deeper flooding sites. But you will see examples where reed canary grass will have floating mats. I've seen that at Swan Lake Nature Sanctuary, where even with the deeper water, you have the vegetation floating on the surface and still setting seed, but it is a possibility to get rid of it through deeper flooding. There's also mechanical removal of reed canary grass. So here volunteers are actually aiming to dig out rhizomes, and then this would be followed up with sheet mulching techniques. And I will show you a few photos of sheet mulching techniques, but also please look at the recording for creating meadows for pollinators, because we talk about smothering and other restoration techniques like sheet mulching in that presentation as well. And shading, just like the Myriophyllum, where a species that depends on sun will be impacted if you provide shade or create shade. So in the case of reed canary grass, you can plant shrubby vegetation, trees, large shrubs, and ultimately it will outcompete reed canary grass. But you don't necessarily want to do that in every instance of reed canary grass, because you can also end up in a situation where you've lost the herbaceous spectrum of wetlands if you just constantly substitute with trees and shrubs. And so in looking for a diversity of habitats, we've also tried other applications, other restoration techniques to rid of reed canary grass, just so we're seeing the whole spectrum of different types of wetlands, including flooded wet meadow. So here's a landowner who's on Quamachin Lake. She's a wonderful land steward. And so you can see her attempts at ridding reed canary grass from her riparian fringe on the lake. She has native shrubs near the water. She also has cattails and other wetland vegetation, but the black pond liner you're seeing there, that was all tall reed canary grass over your head. And so what she did was she chopped it really short, then she smothered it, she weighted it down with sandbags because that's all flooded in the winter. And so she was able to have it down for a year and then was able to revegetate that area. Here's another sample of smothering. So that's a landscape fabric that we had layered, but ideally you're using something that has no porosity to it. So I don't recommend using landscape fabric as a smothering tool for really aggressive species like reed canary grass. I do think that pond liner is better, but you're seeing a stage of restoration in this photo. In the background, you're seeing tall native species like tufted hairgrass and mountain sneezeweed and a variety of sedges. Then you're seeing in the middle a stage where we have removed the smothering tool, the pond liner, and then we've sheet mulched that area ahead of planting. And then in the foreground, you're seeing where we're smothering reed canary grass at the time. And ahead of smothering, just like Elizabeth did in the previous photo, we cut the reed canary grass really short. Here's a picture of that same site in the winter. So it gets flooded. It would get flooded even more deeply than this, but it gives you a sense of this habitat here. And then this is what I was referring to as sheet mulching. So after after that water draws down in the late spring, we remove the pond liner. We've left it down for at least a year with reed canary grass, and then we will sheet mulch. And this is blocking the weedy seeds in the soil that are below. And then we plant through the cardboard and whatever we've used as the topping on the cardboard. So it's sheet mulching. It's just a sandwich technique where you layer the cardboard and then you put something like degraded leaf mulch or something like that, like compost or whatever. But the trick is that it's weed free. And then we plant through it. And so here's an area where the same techniques that I just described had been applied. The reed canary grass has been smothered, pulled the pond liner up, sheet mulched it, and then planted it. And we like to use plugs and seeds to try to cover as much ground as possible economically, and making small incisions into the cardboard for planting, trying not to bring up the weedy soil that is below the cardboard. And the area that we had looked at as a sample where you saw the flooding, this is that same area being planted. And we had help on a couple occasions from the Greater Victoria Green Team. And they're also helping out at Stone Ridge Wetland at that work party I had mentioned. So an area that's been planted and flooded, as I've described, and then seeing that the stages of that restoration happening. So the smothering in the foreground, stage 2 in the middle there of things that have been planted through the cardboard, but starting to grow. And then in the background, a more mature planting that would be at that time a couple years old. And here's what some of those areas look like now. So you can see hardhack and Douglas aster and helenium. And again, these are all just tremendously pollinator friendly. So all our summer bees would be feasting on these species through all through the summer into the early fall. And a few more species ideas. So the purple flower there is self-heal. And then you're looking at monkey flower. Both are very flooding tolerant and extremely pollinator friendly. And a beautiful shot from deeper into a wetland pool that, this is a wetland that's been created and planted, but you're looking at a plant called Siam suave, the white plants in the foreground. And we'll take a closer look at that plant later, but it likes deep flooding. You're looking at species like slough sedge that have the dark flowers just ahead of the mountain sneezeweed there, and so on. But you can imagine the pollinators on species like this. And plants that are very deeply flooded really do flower late. Like this photograph isn't from that long ago. I wanted to highlight some spot smothering as well. So this was a restoration project that I helped on with the Nature Trust of BC at Salmonos Marsh. And Dave Polster from Cowichan had also done a lot of work in this area, removing shrubs to restore the herbaceous layer here, and also restoring the hydrology of the area by breaking a berm. But I just wanted to show you this step of smothering because the technique itself can be applied at different sites. So I wanted to bring it to your attention. But here is a rare species in the seed bank called tall woolly heads. It's annual, an endangered species. And all the green that you're looking at is mowed short reed canary grass that is inhibiting the tall woolly heads from germinating and succeeding. So we did smothering trials and would put this down, killed the reed canary grass when the tall woolly heads wasn't trying to grow. And then you'll see in the bottom right photo, we're lifting an edge to see how set back the reed canary grass is. And it looked pretty good. And then you can see the success that following season. And you can even see the square patterns of the pond liner where reed canary grass had been killed, and all that white fuzzy stuff you're seeing is that endangered species germinating out of the seed bank, and with much higher densities and basically just a solid mat of it. So that was very successful, and I would just call that spot smothering. We do that with other species as well. So if you imagine a scenario in a wetland where you have native plants and non-native plants and you just want to be smothering small patches of sites of infestation, you can do that as well. So yellow flag iris, I think, is the last species I'm going to comment on as a very aggressive non-native species of our region. It has showy yellow flowers, got planted as an ornamental, but as soon as you see it, if you have a small wetland of your own or thinking about digging a site, please do not plant this species. It has wreaked havoc on local wetlands, and we want to be sure to try to get rid of this species. So it's another one where mechanical removal through digging is possible. At Somenos Marsh, they did a lot of excavations using small machines to get rid of the root and the established plants. And in this case, you're seeing, you know, folks from Nature Trust of BC digging yellow flag iris. And then in those disturbed soil areas, what we did was we reseeded native species into those sites. So for homeowners who, you know, some of those other projects look big and just not kind of where you want to go, and what can you do as a homeowner? Well, taking small spaces of your own and modifying them a bit to hold some winter water can make a big difference to the kind of species you can make. So here's a home garden, and that bare soil area that you're seeing is where the soil has been dug down to the bottom clay layer so that it holds water in the winter where it didn't before. So there's no pond liner, no machines, no anything except for just hand digging down to a clay deposit and allowing water to stay perched through the winter, even though it dries to a baking clay in the sun. And that opens up opportunities for a different suite of species that are tolerant of clay soils and also tolerant of winter flooding. And so this is a suite of plants that we planted there and that did super well and remained colorful later into the year after other species had senesced for the season. So here on a larger scale is just the same approach, just on a bigger scale. So here's a pool at the Lochside Pollinator Meadow. You can look up information by just Googling Lochside Pollinator Meadow if you're interested. But here we dug down into the soil profile to the clay layer, no pond liner, again, just the clay, and sowed a seed mix of different plants than what went into the surrounding area. That pool, that depression has perched water through the winter, and then you see a different suite of species that are adapted to those kinds of sites. another homeowner project. So this is on Salt Spring Island, and this homeowner is really passionate about wetlands, wanted to increase habitat diversity on their property. So they just used like a small Kubota and dug some pools. These are deeper pools. They're unlined, but they are deeper, so they hold water longer. And the bottom right picture is where we came in and we did some revegetation with things like you're seeing monkey flowers and jointed rush, and we put all sorts of things in there. And then some of the cattails and other things colonized on their own. But within just a year or so, you can have some pretty magnificent resources for bees and other pollinators in a site like that, if you have the space and resources for it. But again, you can do things that are less fancy than that too. And here's another wonderful Steward from Fairfield. So she created a pond and moisture area in her backyard, and you can see how lush some of these areas are. So she's busy planting a diversity of native shrubs and trees and wildflowers into this space and creating resources that occur over a greater part of the year. So wetlands are incredible spaces for biodiversity that includes plants, which we're going to go into in a moment. And of course, just an amazing array of wildlife will colonize these spaces without any assistance. And the mason bee there in Paige's hand in the top left, even the resources that just the bare soil sites are incredibly important for species of mason bee, for example, that will go gather mud going back to their nests. And you'll find if you put a mason bee box next to a moist bare soil spot, you'll find the success of that box to, I mean, this is just my observations. I don't know if it's true, but I find that those boxes fill up faster than ones that are away from those wet mud resources and just other nesting activity from other bees as well. There are also incredible spaces, you know, creating these wet areas, learning how to restore wetlands is just an amazing community experience. And some of the places that Paige will touch on for learning opportunities, I really encourage you to volunteer. Just the engagement from people and how you can learn just so much about our local ecology and local plants and local wildlife. And it just really brings people together. And I know maybe we're a little not physically distanced in this picture, but this picture is from a long time ago, but maybe our work parties will look a little different, but you get the idea of the camaraderie and friendships that can come from restoration projects or from just doing something on your own property or in your own community group. So if anyone can, from our organizational team here, report back to me about how many minutes I have left, that'll help me gauge how to approach this next section. So Laura or Paige, can you just?
Yeah, you've got about, well, it's 1 o'clock, or sorry, 2:02 now. So if we do another 10 or so minutes of that, then we still have.
That helps me with the pace.
Awesome.
Okay, guys, so I'm gonna just whiz along here, so bear with me for being a bit quick, but then please come back and look at the recording if there's something that you feel just got breezed over too quickly. So wet meadows, I'm talking about full sun sites with the flooding period that exists. So this is covered in water in the winter, but that flooding period is fairly short. So in the spring, there's a drawdown, or even periodically in the winter, you'll see the water fluctuate. And the summer drought is moderate to severe. So just from, you can have places that have full cover of water and then just this cracking, baking clay in the summer. And don't worry about it. You don't need to modify your soils. They're not quote unquote bad soils. You just select the right plants for them. And boy, is there a suite of amazing plants for wet meadows. So Uplands Park is a terrific place to see examples of these kinds of meadows. And these are some of the kinds of plants you would see there. So this comes as a surprise for some people, but common camas is really flooding tolerant. So it's the camas species that can be underwater in the winter. Another species of native buttercup, straight-beaked buttercup. So this is a flooding tolerant native buttercup. It's not rhizomatous like creeping buttercup. It's a clump forming buttercup. So if you have clays or winter flooding, clay soils, consider this. Large leaf lupin. So our beautiful native huge lupin, it occurs at uplands, and it's a real stunner. And just imagine the bumblebees feasting on this species, and they're large bodied animals that are adapted to going into the large flowers of lupin. Bare stem desert parsley. So I have a spelling error there in the parsley, but Lomatium nudicoli or guckmean. It also has a whole range of other common names, but it's a species that has really wide tolerances for habitat types. So you see it anywhere from sand to like flooded sites at kind of a bit higher elevation, and then also these clay meadows. And so at uplands, here's the large leaf lupins with Lomatium nudicoli growing happily together in a site that's extremely wet in the winter. Here's a native annual of wet meadows. And of course the sedges. And sedges and grasses, you might not think of as pollinator plants, but in terms of habitat structure and also in some cases egg laying, like butterflies, they're extremely important. And we have to think about habitats as a whole. And so not to look at things too hyper individualistically, and to think about when you're trying to create pollinator habitat, you're thinking about the whole picture. So another example of wet meadow habitat. So here's Elk Lake Prairie, just along the Pat Bay Highway. It's very open because it's clay saturated soils. Most of it got turned into a dog park, but it's an incredibly diverse, special native prairie that is completely underlooked. It has graceful cinquefoil. It has fool's onion, self-heal, California oatgrass. It has about an acre of native grass, of beautiful native bunch grass, to put that in perspective, just along the highway outside of Elk Lake. And goldenrod is another wonderful plant of clay wet meadows. It can grow in other habitats too, but the pollinator diversity on goldenrod basically can't be beat in terms of abundances and diversity. It's really an unbelievable species. And just so everyone's aware, goldenrod does not cause allergies. That is just a misapplied thought from other species that are wind pollinated that can cause allergies that occurs at the same time when Canada goldenrod's blooming. Canada goldenrod has sticky pollen, insect pollinated, and doesn't have pollen blowing around that can give you allergies. Dagger-leafed rush is another example. And now we're going to move into marshes. So in contrast to wet meadows, these have a longer flooding period and a less severe drought, with and especially more organic or loam soils, so moving away from that strict clay. So at Somenos Marsh, there are some areas that just have the most magnificent, large areas of native water-loving species, like this Persicaria here, where the pollinators are just hard to imagine. I wish I had a picture to capture it, but it may be the most bees I've ever seen that are in patches of water pepper like this. Here's our native mint. You'll note a little bit of the taxonomy there is in flux right now, but we're calling it Mentha canadensis for the time being. Monkey flower, so this is the perennial monkey flower that grows in marshes and other wetland. And this stunner is a native annual called Nodding Beggar Ticks that has just an amazing suite of some of the small native bees that go to it. And here's Douglas's aster, which many of you will know. It's probably our most common aster of our area, packed with pollinators, packed with butterflies included, and loves moist soils, but is also tolerant of other conditions. And if you have any estuary or saltwater considerations, Pacific silverweed's a good candidate, and so is Henderson's checker mallow. So swamps, many of you will, when you think of swamp, you think of more shade, you have a range of flooding conditions, but the summer drought isn't as severe, and you definitely have organic soils. And some of the most characteristic species, Paige had already mentioned, skunk cabbage. Hedge nettle is if you are thinking of restoring more of a woodlandy kind of wetland area, this is a great one for attracting hummingbirds. And of course, stinging nettle, which we've promoted continuously through this workshop series. And these butterfly pictures you're seeing here, these are species that lay eggs on stinging nettle. And the 3 that have the asterisk next to their name, this is the only plant they lay their eggs on. So when you're thinking about conserving or butterflies of our region, or promoting butterflies, or thinking about a butterfly garden, this is a plant to really think about. Native forget-me-not. And another sedge of moist woodland areas, Carex deweyana is a really common one with those characteristic green flowers. Pacific water parsley is a common native plant from the carrot family that you'll see in these shady wet spots. And slough sedge grows across a variety of sites, but including marshes. So I'm gonna do open water, shrubs, and then I promise I will stop. So open water, I just lumped a whole bunch of different kinds of open water areas into it. So I'm referring to permanently open water, but also temporary open water sites where the flooding, the water level will change over the course of a year. And I just have 3 plants here I wanted to bring up. I had mentioned Siam suave earlier, hemlock water parsnip. So it's amazing. I love this plant. It's really amazing for deep water in wetlands. Water smartweed, you saw a photo before, but if you need floating vegetation, this is a wonderful one. And then you'll get tons of bees at all those pink flowers. And a deep water sedge called inflated sedge. So to just end things here, some wetland shrubs. So this photo, this was an area that what you're looking at was entirely reed canary grass converted to this composition of native trees, native shrubs, open water areas, herbaceous vegetation, and wonderful wildlife habitat. And some of the shrubs to think about if you're planting moisture tolerant native shrubs for pollinators. Pacific crab apple's a great choice. And then also those apples are obviously great for birds. Red osier dogwood, just stunning wood. The red color, an amazing thing in the winter. Fruit for birds, and also those nice flowers as well. And here's a sort of archway made of red osier dogwood, so you can do all sorts of cool things, pruning native shrubs like this. Pacific ninebark is another moisture loving shrub. And this is a very wet hedgerow area of Pacific ninebark. So that's a nice hedgerow idea if you have a wet spot, but not necessarily a wet land. And then I have a typo there. It says Pacific ninebark, but really this is black twinberry, Linicera involucrata, and it has yellow tubular flowers for hummingbirds. And then the birds also love those black fruits, but you'll also get a lot of bumblebees at those yellow flowers. And then to highlight another really special butterfly tree / shrub are all the willows. Really important egg-laying habitat. There's a swallowtail on that willow leaf there. And I believe this is the last slide, but this is hardhack, kind of like a native lilac, blooms at the same time as the helenium there. So you get the purple with the yellow. And I think that combination is just incredible. And that's it for me. And thank you so much for taking the time with me today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kristen. We're gonna head back to my screen here. Hopefully you can see our slide there. And so we're just gonna wrap up with a, oh, this is a fun little experiment, with our prizes. But I'm going to also give you folks some resources on planting guides. So part of what we want to highlight is options for planting in wetlands. So we've put together a list of planting guides. Can you guys see that okay? I just sort of did some fandangling. So we'll make sure you can see that. And then what about you, Amy? Are you able to see the planting guides? Awesome.
Yep.
So on saanich-nativeplants.com, on their resources page, they have tons of plant lists, and one of them is native plants for wet meadows, and another one is wetlands. And then you can also check out at the Island Pollinator Initiative website the different planting guides for pollinators that do highlight the wetland focus on there as well. So they have some great options there. And then for resources around wetlands, we just have a few available here. There's a few on the HAT website, and we just put out a new one on specifically on wetlands. And if you're interested in becoming a wetland keeper, there's a handbook put out by the province. There's more on restoration and construction of wetlands by Tom Biebighauser. And someone had a question about wetland protection and legislation in BC, and I would recommend searching up that sentence, wetland ways, and the primary legislation that applies to wetlands are those three: Water Act, Fish Protection Act, and Wildlife Act. We don't have a specific one for wetlands yet. And if you're curious about wetland classification, check out the provincial project. There's the link there. And I just was told by Kristen about this awesome blog post that was put out by Rob Underhill from the Main Island Conservancy about the value of wetlands. So definitely check that out. And if you're interested in training, I have recently gone through the Wetland Keepers training, and in the past I've done the Wetlands Institute, which is a week-long training with the BC Wildlife Federation. They have a wetlands education program. And they've actually turned their week-long training into a speaker series. So each individual talk is available for anybody. It's just by donation, and they have some great topics coming up, and you can just attend one or many if you'd like. So if you want to visit wetlands, here's just a small sampling of options to go and see wetlands locally, but I'm sure, as Kristen mentioned, several that aren't on the list. Stone Ridge Wetland was one that we both mentioned, and they are having a planting work party, and they're in search of volunteers. So if you have time to give a hand on September 13th, the Greater Victoria Green Team is hosting that, and you can look up their website for more information. So we've got time for questions here. I see there's a bunch, and I'm going to pass it over to Amy to moderate.
Great, yes. So yeah, as you mentioned, there was a question about if there is any government protection of wetlands, or if privately held wetland is allowed to be drained at the discretion of the property owner.
Sorry about that. Thirsty. So yeah, as I mentioned, there's a few pieces of legislation that protect wetlands in British Columbia, and I would definitely search up that. It really depends on the site specifically, and landowners or private lands who have wetlands, they have some rights to do that, but typically they have to apply for permits and there's a process. So your municipality would probably have more information about that and if a permit had been applied for or not. Yeah, definitely check with your local municipality on that one.
Okay. And Tamara is wondering about some pollinator-friendly plant suggestions that could be used in the bottom of a rain garden. So a habitat that has fluctuating water levels.
Hi, Tamara. It's Kristen here. So rain gardens can be a little tricky to apply advice to without hearing a little bit more about the project because there are such varied substrates that are used and also variable flooding periods. So some rain gardens are so sharply drained with gravels that they don't hold any water, and so our species selection would be different from a wetland or a rain garden area that had an organic substrate that was meant to keep water throughout the season. But it sounds like that rain garden might have some standing water and it would just fluctuate over the winter. And it sounds like a good site for some of the taller, vigorous wetland species that are tolerant of sort of that periodic flooding that can go up and down over the winter. Like tufted hairgrass would be a good example of that. Douglas aster and Canada goldenrod. And then there are a really nice suite of native sedges like Tracy or hair sedge would be a nice one, or thick-headed sedge or dagger-leafed rush. But maybe Tamara, get in contact with me and we can field some of the details of your rain garden and we'll come up with a nice list for you.
Thanks, Kristen. So Marissa said, is there a concern about bullfrogs predating pollinators in wetlands that are wet year-round? And is there a good method to deter bullfrogs that you know of?
Kristen.
So I'll just comment quickly, but then I'd like to hear from Paige. I'm gonna just touch on the how do you deter bullfrogs from wetlands. The only method I know is to hand collect them and remove them. And also through purposefully creating a wetland space that is a temporary wetland, so that wetland dries out in the summer and then fills back up. So bullfrogs need water for a full annual cycle, holding for a year for their tadpoles to mature. So if that wetland space dries up, then it kills anything that is in there that is bullfrog related. And but maintains our native frog, like Pacific chorus frogs and red-legged frogs. Paige, do you have anything to mention about bullfrogs there?
Yeah, so lots of people know that they exist, but they are an invasive introduced species, and they're from the east coast of North America, and they don't have proper predators in place to kind of control their numbers, and they have huge impacts on our pollinators, but much further reaching than that are, native turtle populations, other amphibians, they eat turtle hatchlings, they eat anything they can fit their mouth around. That being said, as Kristen mentioned, not digging ponds deeper is really good because you don't necessarily need that water year round for our local amphibians. So allowing the wetlands to be more sort of spread across the landscape instead of being a deep, small sort of dugout can really help. And you can chat with you know, wetland restoration specialist or biologist about how to make that a little bit more seasonal in terms of water levels. Generally speaking, bullfrogs like sunnier ponds. So if you have a shadier pond, it's more likely to provide red-legged habitat and salamander habitat. But Pacific chorus frogs do like the sunnier ponds. So it's a bit of a balance. There are professionals out there that can help with bullfrog control, but it's an ongoing issue. There's no real sort of permanent solution for bullfrogs. The best we can do is really keep our ears open for them if we have a pond, and if they show up, try and get on it right away. And I can provide more resources on that. If people have questions, you can email me.
Great, thanks, Paige. So Ariel has asked, so she has a wet meadow exactly as Kristen has described, and they're close to the coast and have a high water table. So she is wondering if she needs to take salinity into account.
Yeah, maybe. If you have a lot of salt spray, or you suspect there's salt water just from spray, but any pooling in a kind of coastal wet area, that there are some really great species to think about. So Henderson's checker mallow is a salt-loving plant, loves like water, flooding in the winter. Tufted hairgrass is really salt tolerant. Hordeum, I can't maybe Amy help me, I can't think of the other name for it, but Hordeum brachyanthorum, it's a barley. I can't, sorry, I'm kind of blanking here, but it is a
meadow barley.
Yeah, meadow barley, thanks. Yeah, meadow barley would be a great one for salt. And there's also springbank clover that might be a wonderful fit, and maybe blue-eyed grass. So that's just a start to get you kind of like thinking about this kind of mix of sedges and wildflowers for a place that might get some salt. And also silverweed would be a good one. So check back with me maybe by email, and again, like we'll try to work out a nice list for you.
And Louise Hermanitz just asked, what about herbivore tolerance? So I guess you're probably wondering, are any of these plants that we've mentioned, deer resistant,
Yeah.
I suppose?
Hi, Louise. I'm so glad you're here. So for deer can be an issue even in wetland habitats. So I'll name a few species that are fairly deer resistant, but sometimes the deer are a little bit resistant to going in deeper water in the winter. So you can get times of year where the plants can grow without them being so grazed, but that just depends on how much flooding there actually is and accessibility for the deer. But the suite of sedges and grasses that we've talked about throughout are all extremely deer resistant. So that would be a good starting point. And then some of the fast growing rhizomatous species, the deer just can't really keep up with them once they're established, and you'll get lots of flowering even if deer are around. So the mountain sneezeweed, goldenrod Douglas aster are all really terrific deer resistant pollinator friendly plants, and then planted out with the other grasses and sedges is a nice kind of assemblage. And I can't really think of anything else offhand, but Louise, if you and I chat, maybe I can come up with a few more ideas for you too.
Okay, and Ariel asked, are there any native willows appropriate for small backyards?
Paige, is it okay if I comment on that one? I feel like I'm answering too many of these things. I would say for all the native willow species that you can prune them to what you want them to be, and to not be too afraid of them. They're not going to turn into like huge weeping willows, like out of your control, eating your whole backyard or anything like that. Like you can kind of keep them more maintained through how you treat them. But for, I probably have to go with Schooler's willow, in terms of it has like a range of tolerances of what it likes, and it's also drought tolerant. And I think probably its max height is maybe a bit shorter.
Thank you. And Bonnie says that she has a very small but very deep pond with very steep sides. It's an old irrigation pond. Are there any ideas for water plants that would fit this?
Yeah, those are tricky sites, because essentially, if you imagine a natural wetland structure has a floodplain associated with it and not the steep sides, but some of the constructed kind of areas that end up with sort of these berms create these areas where you have deep pools of flooding, and then the berms are actually not riparian area. They're just open, and they don't get that kind of periodic flooding. So they're not as well suited to riparian vegetation as you would see in an area that would have normally been periodically flooded. But in those open water areas that aren't part of that fringe, you could consider things like small flowered bulrush. You could think about soft stemmed bulrush and cattails. And all three of those can be vigorous in a small space. So you might want to control, even though they're native, control them to some extent so they don't occupy the whole pool. And then water smartweed is a really good fit. And then newfar with the beautiful yellow petals and floating pads could be another consideration for open water like that. And maybe the last thing I'll say is just water smartweed.
Nice. I saw that Bonnie asked a question later that says, would it be better to dig back the sides or fill the edges to create a shallow area? And I think it's really hard to say, but Kristen, I'm assuming, you know, what Kristen said, there's likely a berm on the sides because they had to put the dirt somewhere when it was dug. So where's the dirt would be my big question. And how shaded or sunny is it? What's your take, Kristen?
Not like 99% of the time, I would say get rid of the berms and create the more natural riparian topography. And it'll allow you, it'll spread that water out over the course of the year, and it'll allow you to have more diversity of vegetation and less of this just deep pool of water with dry edges. Totally.
And so, yeah, look for where they piled the dirt, and also check out wetland restoration and consulting.com. I'll put it in the chat, and other folks that there are wetland restoration specialists that will do site visits and help you with all that kind of stuff. So if you want to do a project, there are people who do that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Alan asked, do you have any arguments or rebuttals for people who are worried about mosquito population increases when they create or restore a wetland on their property? I've heard this concern before and would love to know what to say.
Kristen, do you want to start?
I'll comment, and then Paige, make sure to pipe in there. My truthful experience with this, from my own hands-on experience and what I've heard from others, is that is not a concern. That if you approach a wetland restoration project where it's, you know, fairly, like you don't even have to create much of anything to host a whole suite of wildlife that controls the mosquito larva. So like dragonflies are a great example. And what I've had in my experience is as soon as those wetland areas become available, the dragonflies are laying in there, and within that first year, they're controlling that mosquito larva. Where I've seen mosquito issues arise is partly through the parrot's feather, like the non-native species we talked about. I haven't experienced that, I guess, firsthand, but I have read and heard that because that causes the stagnant water pooling to occur, that's good mosquito breeding habitat. And so I guess I can't speak to that really firsthand, but it is an example of where mosquitoes might get out of control. But in constructed wetland habitat, I haven't experienced that. I was a bit shocked by it, how quickly there's dragonflies and, you know, big water beetles and water striders, and just that overall invertebrate diversity within the pools and not mosquitoes.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I was gonna say. And to add to that, if there's a water body that has a lot of mosquitoes, it's more likely an indicator that that water body has been ditched or is unhealthy and is not functioning with all those predatory insects and other species, the dragonflies and the beetles and all that. So if there's a huge issue with mosquitoes, it's possible that the area had been dug or drained or ditched in the past, and it might need some help. So for the most part, from what I've read as well and learned from the Wetlands Institute, that creating a wetland where there wasn't before does not increase mosquito populations if it's done with habitat in mind, and that's the primary purpose of that wetland. It provides so much habitat for the predators of those mosquitoes and other insects that it's not creating that problem.
Okay. And there was a couple of comments in the chats that related to some of the things that were covered. So I just wanted to be able to add that in, just so that other people have that information. When we were talking about yellow flag iris control, Marissa B. commented that Dr. Catherine Tarasoff has also found much success in using benthic barriers to smother yellow flag iris infestations. So I imagine that's something that people could look up if they Google Dr. Catherine Tarasoff, spelled Tarasoff, and could probably find some more information there. I also know that there is a workshop on yellow flag iris coming up that's being offered by the Capital Regional Invasive Species Partnership, CRISP, and they're looking for registrations right now. So that's also something people could look at if they're specifically dealing with yellow flag iris.
Cool.
Okay, there's another one here. Yeah, so Rebecca was wondering about how much time or work commitment is necessary for maintaining restored wetland areas, and if there are ways or techniques to keep invasive species around the edge from reinvading again once a wetland is restored.
The best technique that I know of is plant density. So that we try to maintain a diversity of plants and that those introductions were done at a high enough density originally through seeding and planting. And then we do experience recolonization from like just seeds coming in, and we will kind of do patchy removal of things, or we'll even do patch smothering of things if we feel like it's going to get out of control. Like if we have planted, you know, big, nice, wet meadow kind of thing, riparian, and then we see reed canary cropping up, we'll take a small piece of pond liner and put it right back down, even if it includes killing a few native plants that are entangled with the reed canary. and then we'll lift that up after a year, and then we'll replant that little pocket. So yes, like I do think it does take maintenance to some extent, but that I find wetland habitat easier to work on than dry meadow.
Okay. Great. Okay, I think, how are you guys feeling? Should we do a couple more questions, or are we ready for prizes?
We could do prizes and then go back to maybe one or two other questions.
All right,
And
sounds
can
good.
I just mention just quickly, I just saw that Galliano Conservancy is doing a wetland creation workshop. So I posted the details in the chat here, and I'll also post the info for the Stone Ridge Wetland workshop that's coming up in a couple of weeks, where you'll get to have hands-on experience with a diversity of native wetland plants and learn about parrot's feather removal as well.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a great opportunity. Okay, let's see. Well, I think that question about bullfrogs was incited an interesting conversation. So that was Marissa B. And so I'm going to select that one for the Moderator's Choice Award, which was the Wetlands book. And then for the other award, which was the Hat and the Seeds from Hat, I am going to randomly choose a person from our participants today. And I'm going to choose Jen Rashley. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but Jen Rashley.
Awesome.
So
Marissa,
yeah, go ahead, Paige.
Marissa and Jen, if you want those prizes, you can email me, paige@hat.bc.ca, and we'll get you set up to receive those. Thanks so much, Amy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So we'll finish up with just a couple last questions then. Go back to here. So here's are there any pollinators that are more closely related or specialized to wetland or aquatic habitat?
Nice. Yeah, maybe, I don't know if Laura is still on, but the one that I mentioned, Laura had just told me about, the Adrena bee is specialized to wetland plants and will nest in the edges around vernal pools, which are those seasonal or ephemeral wetland areas. And there are likely many others that are associated with wetland species. I don't know any off the top of my head, but I will certainly do some research and maybe Laura can add to it.
Yeah, that was great, Paige. Yeah, there's a number of Andrena, also some sweat bees that will nest around pools. And you know, one really important thing that you guys have mentioned as well about these wetlands is they do have the late blooming flowers. So they are really important for a number of species that either come out later in the season or have those longer flight periods. So things like bumblebees, the colonies will last from the spring till the fall. Those new queens that are emerging need those late flowering plants. So in addition to the ones that are either specialists on those wetland plants, there are also the ones that maybe don't specialize on those wetland plants, but really use them for that later bloom.
Neat. Okay. And then what is the best way to get rid of hardy invasive species like knotweed that are close to wetlands, given that herbicides can't be applied within a certain distance of water bodies?
Well, if you are in the Capital Regional District, or the CRD, they have a dedicated invasive species program coordinator, and you can just search CRD invasive and that will come up. There are particular protocols that have been designed by Metro Vancouver, I believe, that are best management practices for knotweed. And there are, depending on the circumstances, there are specific herbicides that will effectively work in aquatic environments, but those have to obviously be applied by a professional and gone through a permitting process. There are other techniques that work for knotweed, like continuous sort of cutting or applying herbicide in a very specific way or a specific time that will have less or the least amount of impact. But I would definitely chat with the CRD on those best management practices for that.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up now. There are some other good questions, and you can always feel free to reach out to the panelists today if you want to discuss further. But thank you for all the great questions. Thank you so much to Paige and Kristen for your wonderful presentations today. I certainly learned a lot, and yeah, look forward to seeing folks at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And you can find this recording on the Island Pollinator Initiative website. And the next one, I think, is on September 17th. So we'll see you then. Bye.
Okay, thanks all.